The Duke dressed as a footman to watch his fiancée, and her words broke his heart. The sentiment was a bitter poison, a self-inflicted wound he had been nursing for weeks, ever since the marriage contract had been signed. From his cold, echoing London townhouse, Duke Alastair Beaumont, the master of Blackwood and its vast, unyielding lands, had imagined his betrothed Lady Alara Vance as a creature of pure, calculating ambition. He had seen her type before, in the gilded ballrooms and treacherous drawing-rooms of the Ton, women with eyes that glittered like diamonds but held the same hardness, their smiles as sharp and practiced as a duelist's blade. They saw his title, his fortune, his ancient and powerful name. They never saw the man. And the one time he had thought, foolishly, that a woman saw him, the betrayal had left a scar across his soul deeper than any blade could cut. So he had devised this test, this cruel masquerade. He would not be the Duke of Blackwood, arriving with pomp and ceremony to inspect his new acquisition. He would be Alec, a simple footman sent ahead with a small party of staff to prepare the supposedly crumbling Vance estate for its new master. He would watch her when her guard was down. He would listen to her unguarded words, waiting for the inevitable slip, the moment her avarice would show its ugly face. He craved the proof of her unworthiness, for it would reaffirm the stone wall he had built around his heart. It was a miserable, dishonorable sort of comfort, but it was the only kind he knew. Meanwhile, at Stillwater Manor, a house that sighed with the gentle melancholy of long-forgotten grandeur, Alara Vance sat by a window, the weak afternoon light illuminating the fine, almost invisible stitches she was weaving into the frayed cuff of her late mother's gown. It was the only suitable dress she owned for meeting a duke, and it was as tired and worn as her spirit. The letter lay on the table beside her, its crisp parchment and imperious seal a stark contrast to the faded damask of the chair. A lifeline and a noose all in one. It promised to save her father from debtor's prison, to rescue their home from the encroaching weeds and unpaid taxes, to restore the honor of their name. But the price was her life, her future, her hand, given to a man she had never met, a man spoken of in whispers as the Iron Duke. A cold, remote figure of immense power and, it was rumored, immense sorrow. She traced the crumbling mortar of the window frame with a fingertip. She was not afraid of poverty. She was accustomed to it. She feared the gilded cage. She feared the cold eyes of a stranger who would own her as he owned his lands. Another beautiful object to be displayed and forgotten. A tear she refused to shed burned behind her eyes. Duty was a heavy cloak, and she had worn it for so long. She would wear it still. She would be a perfect, placid duchess. She would smile and nod and never betray the wild, desperate yearning of her heart for something real. The sound of a carriage on the gravel drive startled her. It was too soon for the Duke. Her father entered the room, his face a mixture of hope and terror. "They are here," he breathed. The Duke's advance staff. Alastair stepped down from the carriage, his borrowed livery feeling stiff and unfamiliar. The house was worse than he'd imagined. It wasn't a ruin, but it was weary, the stones stained with damp, the gardens a beautiful, tangled wilderness. It had the air of a place that had been loved to the point of exhaustion. A stout, flustered housekeeper led him and the others inside. And then he saw her. She was descending the main staircase, her hand trailing on the worn, polished wood of the banister. She was not the dazzling beauty he had half expected, nor the simpering coquette. Her face was pale, her expression grave, her gray eyes wide and startlingly direct. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held her head, a resilience in the straight line of her spine. She wore a simple, faded blue gown, and he saw, with a strange pang, the meticulous mending at the cuff. This was not the portrait of a grasping opportunist. This was the portrait of a woman bracing for a storm. She greeted the senior staff with quiet courtesy, her voice low and clear. Then her eyes fell upon him, lingering for a moment. He was just a footman, another pair of hands. He lowered his own gaze, playing his part. "Welcome to Stillwater," she said to them all, though her voice seemed to carry directly to him. "We are grateful for your assistance." There was no artifice in her tone, only a profound, aching sincerity. Alistair felt the first unwelcome tremor in the foundations of his certainty. This was not going to be as simple as he had thought. The first days were a study in dissonance for Alistair. As Alec, he was assigned the most menial of tasks he had only ever witnessed from a great distance. He was clumsy with a polishing cloth, awkward when fetching water, and utterly inept at building a proper fire without filling the room with smoke. He, who could command a regiment and navigate the treacherous currents of Parliament, could not properly blacken a pair of boots. The other servants eyed him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He was too tall, his shoulders too broad for the ill-fitting livery. His hands, though he tried to roughen them, were still too obviously the hands of a gentleman. But it was Lady Alara who watched him most closely, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, unnerving perceptiveness. He expected her to be idle, to drift through the preparations like a ghost in her own home, issuing orders she was unaccustomed to giving. Instead, she worked. He found her in the kitchens, her sleeves rolled up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she instructed the cook on how to stretch their meager larder to feed the new arrivals. He saw her in the garden, her fine hands, stained with earth, carefully tending to a patch of medicinal herbs. She moved with a purpose and grace that was entirely at odds with his image of a helpless, decorative aristocrat. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was holding the line. One afternoon, a sudden squall blew in from the west, a furious onslaught of wind and rain. A panicked cry came from the stables. Alistair followed Alara as she ran, her skirts hitched up, heedless of the mud. One of the ancient oaks at the edge of the paddock had split, a massive limb crashing down onto the roof of the stable, trapping a young foal inside with its terrified mother. The stable master was wringing his hands, declaring it a lost cause until the storm passed. "The roof will collapse entirely if we wait," Alara stated, her voice cutting through the wind. Her eyes scanned the damage not with fear, but with a swift, practical assessment. "We need to shore up that beam and get them out now." Before Alistair could stop himself, he was moving. The instincts of a commander took over. "You get that cart pole. And you, fetch the thickest ropes you can find," he issued orders with an authority that made the other men jump to obey. He saw Alara's eyes widen in surprise, but there was no time to question it. He directed the men to create a lever, using his own strength to brace a cracking support beam. It was heavy, brutal work. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and mud sucked at his boots. He felt a splinter drive deep into his palm, but he ignored the sharp sting of it. Through it all, Alara was there, not shrinking from the chaos but right in the heart of it, calming the frantic mare with low, soothing murmurs, her hand steady on the animal's trembling neck. Once the beam was secured, she led the mare and its foal out into the lashing rain. For a moment, they stood there, soaked and breathing heavily, the shared crisis creating a strange intimacy. "Thank you, Alec," she said, her gaze fixed on his face. "You were remarkably resourceful." There was an unspoken question in her eyes. Footmen were not typically versed in engineering and command. He merely nodded, his heart thudding for a reason that had nothing to do with exertion. Later, as she was tending to a cut on his arm with a gentleness that felt entirely foreign to him, she noticed the splinter in his palm. "You should have told me," she chided softly, her touch sending a jolt through him. As she worked the wood from his flesh with a needle, her brow knitted in concentration. He found himself studying the fine lines around her eyes, the determined set of her mouth. He had come here to judge her, but it was he who felt judged and found wanting. This woman was no fragile flower. She was the oak that withstood the storm. The incident in the stables shifted something between them. The polite distance of mistress and servant began to fray at the edges, replaced by a tentative, unspoken awareness. They found themselves in a strange orbit, drawn together by the quiet tasks that filled the days. Alistair, as Alec, was assigned to help her in the neglected library, sorting and cataloging the crumbling books that were her father's only remaining treasure. The room smelled of dust and decaying paper and beeswax, a scent he found surprisingly comforting. Here, away from the prying eyes of the other staff, the silence was companionable rather than awkward. One evening, as rain whispered against the leaded glass panes, Elara looked up from a heavy leather-bound tome, a small, wistful smile on her face. "My mother used to read to me in this room," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. "She said that books were the only magic she truly believed in. They could transport you, you see, even when your own world feels very small." Alistair, perched precariously on a ladder, paused in his work. "And do you believe in that magic?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Her smile faded slightly. "I believe in their comfort. In the escape they offer." She traced the gilt lettering on the book's spine. "Soon, I suppose I will have all the books I could ever wish for, in a library far grander than this one. But I wonder if they will hold the same peace." He knew she was speaking of his library at Blackwood Keep, a cavernous, two-story marvel of architecture that he rarely set foot in. To him, it was just another room, another possession. To her, this dusty, neglected chamber was a sanctuary. "Perhaps peace is not something a room can hold," he found himself saying, the words coming from a place he kept locked away. "Perhaps it is something we must carry within ourselves." She looked up at him then, and her gray eyes seemed to see past the footman's livery, past the grime on his hands, and into the desolate emptiness he had carried for so long. "That is a very profound thought for a footman," she said, not as an accusation, but with a genuine, gentle curiosity. He felt a flush of heat rise in his neck and quickly looked away, fumbling with a stack of books. "I've had a lot of time for thinking," he muttered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Later, as they worked, a small, frightened field mouse darted out from behind a bookshelf. Elara didn't scream or recoil as he'd seen other ladies do. She simply knelt, her expression soft, and coaxed it onto a piece of card, carrying it carefully to the open window and setting it free in the garden. He watched the simple, unthinking act of kindness, and the armor around his heart, already cracked, began to truly buckle. He was seeing the truth of her, in these small, unguarded moments. Her gentleness with a frightened creature, her reverence for old books, the quiet sorrow in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. This was not a performance. This was who she was, and the knowledge filled him with a confusing mixture of soaring hope and crushing guilt. He was beginning to care for this woman, deeply and sincerely, and every moment he continued his deception, he was betraying the very authenticity he was coming to admire. The days bled into a week, then two. A strange, domestic rhythm established itself, a fragile peace that felt both wonderful and deeply perilous. Alistair found he was forgetting to be the Duke. He was simply Alec, a man who found purpose in mending a broken gate latch for Elara, or in the quiet approval in her eyes when he managed to coax a flame in the damp hearth. He learned the cadence of her speech, the way she worried her lower lip when she was deep in thought, the faint scent of lavender and rain that always seemed to cling to her. He discovered her secret passion for sketching. She filled a worn leather-bound book with startlingly lifelike drawings of the wildflowers in the garden, the brooding sky, the weary face of her father. She had an artist's soul, full of a quiet, intense observation that he recognized in himself. One afternoon, she was sitting on a stone bench in the garden, her sketchbook open on her lap, when he approached with a tray of tea she hadn't asked for. He used it as an excuse, a reason to be near her. She looked up, startled, and a gust of wind caught the pages of her book, flipping them open. He saw a drawing that made his breath catch. It was a sketch of him, of Alec. He was shown from the side, mending the stable roof, his brow furrowed in concentration, the muscles in his back tensed with effort. She had captured him with an unnerving accuracy, but it was not just a physical likeness. She had drawn the weariness in his posture, the solitude he carried like a cloak. She had drawn a man, not a servant. Her face flushed a deep crimson as she snapped the book shut. "Forgive me. I should not have." "It's very good," he said, his voice quiet. "You are very talented." She clutched the book to her chest, a shield against his gaze. It is just a foolish pastime. It is not foolish to see the world as it is, he countered softly, or to see people as they are. A tense silence fell between them. The air was thick with things unsaid. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to cast off the suffocating livery and the lie that came with it. He wanted to tell her that he was not the cold, unfeeling duke she dreaded, that he saw her, truly saw her, and that what he saw was more wonderful than he could ever have imagined. But the words were trapped behind the wall of his own making. How could he? The truth would not set him free. It would destroy this fragile, precious thing that was growing between them. It would prove him to be a liar and a manipulator, confirming her worst fears about the man she was bound to marry. A letter arrived that evening, bearing his own ducal seal. His secretary, following his instructions, had penned a missive announcing that His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, would be arriving in 3 days' time. The news landed like a stone in the quiet pool of Stillwater Manor. Alara's father was thrown into a flustered panic, but Alara herself became very still, a chilling quietness descending upon her. Later that night, unable to sleep, Alistair found her in the library, staring into the dying embers of the fire. She didn't seem to hear him enter. "I am a coward," she whispered to the flames, her voice raw with a pain that lanced through him. He stood frozen in the doorway. He should leave, grant her this private moment of grief. But he was rooted to the spot, a helpless witness to the anguish he himself had orchestrated. She finally turned, her eyes finding his in the dim light. They were shadowed, haunted. "He is coming, Alec." "The Duke," she said the title as if it were a curse. "Soon, this will all be over. This quiet, this peace. It will be gone." "You do not know that," he said, his own voice hoarse. "Perhaps he is not what you expect." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. It was a terrible sound. Men of such power are all the same. They see the world as a thing to be owned, to be controlled. They do not see the people in it. I am to be his duchess, a fixture in his home, a bearer of his heirs. A possession. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of profound self-protection. "I am to be sold, Alec, to save this house. I understand that. It is my duty. I pray he is not a cruel master, but I expect no more than a gilded cage. I will smile and I will be perfect, and a part of me will die." The Duke dressed as a footman to watch his fiancée, and her words broke his heart. It was not the shattering of an illusion, but the shattering of himself. He had come here expecting to hear the calculations of a gold digger. Instead, he heard the death sentence of a sensitive, terrified soul. She was not rejecting his title or his wealth. She was terrified of the cold, unfeeling man she believed him to be, the man he had spent years becoming. His deception had not been a test of her character, but a mirror to his own monstrous failure. He had set a trap for her, and in it had caught his own heart, which now lay bleeding and broken at his feet. He had wanted to wound her with the truth of her own avarice. Instead, she had utterly devastated him with the truth of her fear. In the 2 days that followed Alara's soul-bearing confession, the atmosphere at Stillwater grew thick with an almost unbearable tension. Alistair, reeling from the blow of her words, found it nearly impossible to maintain his disguise. The role of the detached observer was gone, replaced by an urgent, desperate need to protect her from the very man he was pretending not to be. He watched her move through the frantic preparations for the Duke's arrival, a ghost at a feast held in her own honor, her face a pale, polite mask that didn't quite conceal the panic in her eyes. Every deferential "my lady" he was forced to utter felt like a fresh betrayal. His turmoil did not go unnoticed. A new arrival, Lord Harrington, a neighboring landowner with a predatory smile and an overly familiar manner, descended upon the manor. Harrington had once been a suitor for Alara's hand, a suit her father had rejected due to his reputation for ruthlessness. Now, with the Vance family's desperation public knowledge, he circled like a vulture, his condescension barely veiled. "My dear Alara," Harrington drawled, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips as she supervised the polishing of silver in the dining hall. All this fuss for the great Duke. One hopes he appreciates the effort. Men of his station are so rarely appreciative of the finer things. His eyes raked over her, insolent and possessive. Alara pulled her hand away, a faint blush of anger on her cheeks. The Duke is our guest, Lord Harrington. It is only proper. Harrington's gaze then fell upon Alistair, who was standing nearby, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And this is the new help? He's a large fellow for a footman. Looks more like a pugilist, he smirked. See that you polish the silver properly, boy. Your mistress's future depends on making a good impression. The sheer, naked contempt in the man's voice ignited a fuse in Alistair. An ancient, aristocratic fury, the kind he had not felt in years, surged through him. You will address Lady Alara with respect, Alistair said, his voice low and lethally cold. It was not the voice of a servant. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. The room went silent. The other servants froze. Harrington's smirk vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. Alara stared at Alec, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. For a fleeting second, the footman was gone, and in his place stood a figure of immense, intimidating power. Realizing his catastrophic slip, Alistair immediately lowered his gaze, forcing a subservient slump into his shoulders. Begging your pardon, my lord. I misspoke, but the damage was done. Harrington's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion dawning. He studied Alistair's face, his posture, the unconscious authority that still clung to him like a shroud. I have a feeling, Harrington said slowly, his voice laced with a new, dangerous curiosity, that there is more to you than meets the eye. That evening, the storm inside the house mirrored the one that had begun to brew outside. The air was electric, charged with unspoken emotions. Alara sought Alec out in the library, where he was meant to be mending a bookbinding but was instead staring, unseeing, into the fire. Who are you? She asked, her voice a trembling whisper. There was no one else there, the pretense of their stations momentarily forgotten. Today, with Lord Harrington, you were not a footman. He turned to face her, the torment clear on his features. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear, the confusion, and something else, a fragile hope that he was more than he seemed, which was somehow more painful than her suspicion. He wanted to tell her. God, how he wanted to confess everything, to fall to his knees and beg for the forgiveness he did not deserve. He took a step towards her, his hand rising as if to cup her cheek. She didn't flinch, her gaze locked with his. The space between them crackled. He could smell the faint scent of her hair, see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. This was it, the precipice. He could end the lie now. But what would he say? Forgive me, I am the cold, powerful man you dread, the one who came here to trick you, to test you like a piece of livestock, and in doing so, have fallen hopelessly in love with you. The confession was a monster. He let his hand fall to his side, the lie a physical weight in his chest. I am no one of importance, he said, the words tasting of self-loathing. He saw the hope in her eyes die, replaced by a familiar, heartbreaking resignation. He had failed her yet again. He had chosen the coward's path, prolonging the agony, and in doing so, had set the stage for a far more devastating revelation. The day of the Duke's arrival dawned gray and oppressive. A fine, weeping mist clung to the trees, and the air was heavy with the promise of a storm. Lord Harrington, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph, arrived not long after breakfast. He had clearly spent the previous day making inquiries. He carried himself with the air of a man holding a winning hand, his smile sharp and cruel. He found Alara in the great hall, giving last-minute instructions to the nervous staff. Her father stood beside her, wringing his hands. Alistair was there, a silent statue of misery, his duty to attend the door. A momentous day, Lady Alara, Harrington began, his voice booming with false cheer. The conquering hero arrives to claim his prize. I have come to offer my humble welcome to his grace as well. That is kind of you, my lord, Elara murmured, her attention on the driveway. Oh, I am nothing if not kind, Harrington purred. He took a deliberate step closer, his gaze sliding past her to fix on Alistair. In fact, I have uncovered a most amusing piece of information. A fascinating case of mistaken identity. Elara's head snapped up. Her eyes darted from Harrington to Alec, a terrible premonition dawning on her face. Alistair felt the blood drain from his. He could see it coming, the collision he had set in motion, and he was powerless to stop it. You see, Harrington continued, savoring the moment, drawing it out for maximum cruelty. I found myself wondering about your remarkably well-spoken, authoritative footman. A man of his talents seems so wasted. So I sent a rider to my cousin in London, who has had dealings with the reclusive Duke of Blackwood. I sent a description. He paused, letting the silence stretch. It seems the Duke is a tall man, scar on his left palm from a childhood fencing accident. He flicked his eyes to Alistair's hand, the hand Elara had so gently tended. And he has a penchant for unusual methods. The world seemed to slow down. Elara's gaze followed Harrington's. She stared at Alistair's hand, then slowly, so slowly, lifted her eyes to his face. And in that instant, she saw it all. The aristocratic bearing he could not quite hide. The command in his voice. The intelligence in his eyes. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such monstrous, calculated deception that it stole the air from her lungs. Alec, the kind, resourceful, quiet man she had shared secrets with, the man whose companionship had become a small, warm light in her encroaching darkness, the man she was perhaps, terrifyingly, beginning to love, he did not exist. He was a phantom, a lie. In his place stood the Iron Duke, the cold stranger, her jailer. My dear, Harrington said, his voice dripping with mock pity as he delivered the killing blow. Allow me to present him properly. It seems your footman is none other than your magnificent fiancé, the Duke of Blackwood himself. A small, broken sound escaped Elara's lips. The color drained from her face, leaving it a mask of chalky white. Her eyes, fixed on Alistair, filled with a succession of emotions so swift and violent it was like watching a physical blow land. Stunned disbelief, dawning comprehension, and then a wave of such profound, agonizing betrayal that it physically buckled her. She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her mouth. The trust, the warmth, the shared vulnerability. All of it was a lie, a game, a cruel, humiliating test she hadn't even known she was taking. She was not a person to him. She was a specimen to be observed under glass. Is it true? She whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the cavernous hall. Alistair could not speak. He could only nod, his entire being consumed by a tidal wave of shame and regret. The single, slight movement of his head was a confession that shattered her world. Her spine, which had been bent with sorrow, suddenly straightened. The heartbreak in her eyes hardened into a diamond-sharp fury. All the quiet dignity, all the resilient strength he had come to admire, now coalesced into a righteous, protective rage. Get out, she said, her voice low and shaking with the force of her pain. Her father started to protest. Elara, my dear, the Duke? I am not speaking to the Duke. She cut him off, her gaze never leaving Alistair's. I am speaking to the man who stood in my home and lied to my face. I am speaking to the man who pretended to be a friend while judging my every move. I am speaking to a coward. She took a deep breath, her voice rising, ringing with the clarity of absolute conviction. Get out of my house. The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Harrington's triumphant smirk wavered, the scene having turned from amusing drama to something raw and deeply uncomfortable. The servants stared, frozen. Alistair felt her words like a physical branding, searing his soul. He had come to her home as a judge and had been unequivocally condemned. And the worst part of it all was that he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his days, that he deserved it. He turned, without a word, and walked out of the house, the grand doors closing behind him with a sound of utter finality, shutting him out of the only place where he had, for a brief, beautiful time, felt something real. Blackwood Keep was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. The vast, echoing halls, the priceless tapestries, the armies of silent, deferential servants. It all served as a monument to his failure. Alistair walked through the cold, magnificent rooms, each one a testament to the power and wealth he had used to insulate himself from the world, and felt nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness. The ghost of Alara was everywhere. He saw her in the grand library, imagining her quiet reverence for the books he had never bothered to read. He saw her in the gardens, picturing her delight at the riot of roses he had always taken for granted. He heard her voice, not the furious, broken command for him to leave, but the soft, wistful whisper in the firelight, speaking of gilded cages and dying souls. He had become the monster she feared, a man so terrified of being deceived that he had become the deceiver. He dismissed his valet, ignored his secretary, and shut himself away with a bottle of brandy and the crushing weight of his own folly. He had wanted to expose her as false, but had only succeeded in exposing the utter barrenness of his own heart. The Alec she had known, the quiet, capable man who listened, who helped, who cared, was closer to the man he wished he could be than the cold, suspicious Duke he actually was. The disguise had not been a complete lie. It had been a glimpse of a better self, a self he had buried long ago beneath layers of grief and cynicism. And he had murdered that man with his own hands, right in front of her. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was not from Alara, but from her father. The script was shaky, the words formal and stiff, but the message was unequivocal. In light of the Duke's unconventional methods, and his daughter's subsequent distress, the Vance family wished to withdraw from the marriage contract. They understood the financial and social consequences and were prepared to accept them. A small, sealed note was enclosed. This one was from her. Her handwriting was firm, decisive. "Your Grace," it read, "I release you from your obligation. I will not be a prize won by deceit, nor the duchess of a man who holds trust in such low esteem. I will face ruin with my honor, something you clearly value less than your pride. I wish you a life as empty as your methods. Lady Alara Vance." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking him where he was most vulnerable. She was choosing poverty and disgrace over a life with him. She was asserting her own worth, refusing to be diminished by his cruelty. He admired her for it, a fierce, painful admiration that twisted the knife of his regret even deeper. He had not broken her. He had revealed an inner strength he had never suspected. He crumpled the note in his fist, the sharp edges of the paper digging into his skin, a pale imitation of the pain scoring his soul. At Stillwater, a grim resolve had settled over the house. The Duke was gone, and with him the promise of salvation. The extra staff had been dismissed, the polished silver put away. The creditors, who had been held at bay by the news of the ducal engagement, began to circle once more, their letters growing more demanding. Alara worked tirelessly, from dawn until dusk. She dismissed the last of the household servants, save for the elderly cook, keeping them on as tenants in the estate cottages rather than casting them out. She learned to cook, to scrub floors, to manage the neglected accounts herself. She worked in the garden until her hands were raw and blistered, planting vegetables to see them through the winter. She was not just trying to save her home. She was trying to scrub the memory of him from her soul. But it was impossible. She mourned Alec with a grief that was sharp and constant. She missed his quiet presence, the unexpected depth in his eyes, the feeling of rightness when they had worked side by side. That grief was tangled with a white-hot fury for the Duke, for his arrogance and his cruelty. The two men were one and the same, a paradox that tore at her heart. She had allowed herself to trust, to feel, to hope, and the punishment for that brief lapse had been a public humiliation and a private agony that left her feeling scoured and empty. She would survive. She would hold her head high. But she feared the vibrant, hopeful part of herself had been irrevocably broken by the man who was both Alec and Alistair. Weeks turned into a month. Alistair did not contest the broken engagement. He let the tongue whisper, let them speculate on the scandal. He did not care. He was a man adrift. One evening, his old friend and solicitor, Mr. Davies, a man whose quiet wisdom had guided him for years, came to see him. He found the Duke staring into a cold hearth, a shadow of his former self. "You look like hell, Alistair," Davies said, forgoing any titles. "I feel worse. I have been making some inquiries, as you asked," Davies said gently, placing a folder on the table. "Regarding the Vance estate, the debts are considerable. The primary mortgage is held by a man named Calloway, a particularly nasty piece of work. He is foreclosing. They will be out by the end of the month." Alistair's head snapped up. "Who does Calloway work for?" Davies hesitated. "His primary investor, the man who has been urging him to acquire the Vance land for years, is Lord Harrington." The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Harrington had not just been a malicious gossip. He had been an active predator, waiting for his moment to strike, to ruin the Vances and seize their land, with Alara as part of the spoils. And he, Alistair, had handed him the perfect weapon. His deception had not only broken Alara's heart, but had also cleared the path for her utter destruction. A new feeling cut through the fog of his self-pity. A cold, clear rage. Not just at Harrington, but at himself. He had been so consumed by his own past wounds that he had become blind to the real threat facing the woman he loved. Loved. The word echoed in the silent room, stark and undeniable. He loved her. He loved her strength, her kindness, her quiet dignity, her artist soul, and he had destroyed any chance of being with her. But he could still save her. He could use his power, the very thing she dreaded, for good. He could pay off the debts, send Harrington packing, and ensure her security from a distance. She would have her home, her freedom. She would never have to know. It would be a penance, a silent act of devotion. But as he formulated the plan, he knew it was not enough. It was the Duke's solution. Money and power, wielded from on high. It was another form of control, another gilded cage, however well-intentioned. It was not what Alec would do, and it was not what Alara deserved. She didn't need a savior. She needed a man, an honest man. To win her back, to even have a chance at earning her forgiveness, he couldn't send his money. He had to send himself. He had to tear down the last vestiges of the Iron Duke and show her the man he could be. He had to be vulnerable. He had to be real. And he had to be prepared for her to turn him away forever. It was a terrifying prospect, but for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Beaumont knew exactly what he had to do. He arrived at Stillwater not in a ducal carriage, but on a plain, sturdy riding horse, looking less like a duke and more like a land agent. He wore simple, well-worn riding breeches and a plain linen shirt, his ducal signet ring left behind on his dresser. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves on the ancient oaks were turning to gold and fire. The estate looked even more tired than he remembered, the creeping signs of neglect accelerating. He did not go to the front door. He knew he would not be welcome there. Instead, he tethered his horse and walked towards the fields, where he could see a small group of people working to bring in the meager harvest. He saw her immediately. She was wearing a practical wool skirt and a faded blouse, her hair tied back simply. She was working alongside two older men who must have been former tenants, her movements efficient and strong as she loaded potatoes into a wicker basket. There were new lines of strain around her eyes, but her back was straight, her head held high. She was a queen commanding a dwindling, loyal army. His heart ached at the sight of her. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. One of the men saw him first and straightened up, his hand going to the pitchfork he held, his expression wary. Alara followed his gaze, and her body went rigid. Her hands, covered in dirt, stilled on the basket. Her face became a cool, unreadable mask, but he could see the flicker of pain in her eyes before she shuddered it away. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice quiet. "Your Grace," she replied, the title a block of ice between them. "You are trespassing. This is private property." "For now," he acknowledged, his gaze steady. "I know about Calloway. And Harrington." A flash of anger crossed her face. "Have you come to gloat? To see how far the mighty have fallen? So you can feel better about your own deceptions?" "No," he said simply. He took another step forward, holding out a sheaf of papers tied with a ribbon. "I came to give you this." She eyed the documents with suspicion. "I want nothing from you. Please, just look." His voice was raw with sincerity. He wasn't commanding, he was pleading. Hesitantly, she wiped her hands on her skirt and took the papers from him. She unrolled them. Her eyes scanned the legal text, her brows drawing together in confusion, then widening in disbelief. They were the mortgage notes for Stillwater Manor and all its lands. Across each one, in bold black ink, were the words "paid in full." Below that, the deed of ownership, transferred solely and irrevocably to her name. Lady Alara Vance. Not her father. Her. She looked up at him, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. "What is this? What trick?" "It is not a trick," he said, his heart pounding in his chest. "And it is not a gift to buy your hand or your forgiveness. It is restitution. It is an apology for the damage I caused, for the position I put you in, for enabling a man like Harrington to threaten you. This is yours, unconditionally. Your home, your land, your freedom. You owe me nothing. You never have to see me again. I could not live with myself knowing my actions might have cost you this." She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the hidden clause, the ducal arrogance. But she saw none of it. She saw only a man standing before her, stripped of his title and his power, his eyes filled with a profound and painful honesty. She saw the vulnerability she had once glimpsed in Alec, now laid bare in the Duke. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing 1,000 questions. "Because I was a fool," he said, the confession costing him everything and yet freeing him in a way he had never known. "I was a coward, just as you said. I was so afraid of being hurt, of being seen only for my title, that I hid behind it and became the very thing I despised. I came here to test you, Alara, and I found someone with more honor and integrity in her little finger than I had in my entire being. I fell in love with you, not with Lady Alara Vance, the prospective Duchess, but with you, the woman who mends her own dresses, who is kind to field mice, who saves foals in a storm, and who fights for her home with every breath in her body." He took a ragged breath. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that, but I had to tell you the truth. All of it." He turned to leave, to honor his promise to walk away and never bother her again. "Wait," she called out, her voice shaky but clear. He stopped, his back still to her. "Alistair." It was the first time she had ever said his name. He turned slowly. The icy mask on her face had melted, and tears were tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was still holding the deeds, clutching them to her chest like a shield. "You said you came to test me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you were the one who was tested. And you failed spectacularly." A sad, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "I know. But," she continued, taking a hesitant step towards him, perhaps a man who can admit that, who can stand in a potato field and strip his soul bare, perhaps that man deserves a second chance to pass." Hope, so fierce and bright it was almost painful, exploded in his chest. He didn't move, didn't dare to breathe, leaving the choice, the power, entirely in her hands. She closed the distance between them, stopping just before him. She looked from the deeds in her hand to the man before her. One represented security, freedom. The other represented a future she had only just begun to let herself dream of. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out her dirt-stained hand and laid it on his arm. His skin, his heart, his very soul caught fire at her touch. Their wedding was not a grand affair of the ton. It was a small, quiet ceremony held in the lovingly restored chapel at Stillwater Manor, attended only by her father, a few loyal tenants, and his friend, Mr. Davies. Alara wore the same faded blue gown her mother had worn, the one she had so carefully mended, not as a symbol of poverty, but as a symbol of resilience and enduring love. Alistair stood beside her, not as the Iron Duke in formal silks, but as a man, his heart open and vulnerable, his eyes fixed on the woman who had saved him from himself. They did not live a life dictated by the seasons of London society. They divided their time between the imposing grandeur of Blackwood Keep and the gentle, lived-in warmth of Stillwater. Alara brought light and life to the echoing halls of the keep, filling the vast library with flowers from her garden and the sound of her playing the pianoforte. She taught Alistair the names of the wildflowers and the simple joy of working with his hands. In turn, he brought his formidable intelligence and resources to revitalizing Stillwater and the surrounding tenant farms, not as a distant landlord, but as a partner, listening to Alara's practical wisdom and earning the respect of the people who worked the land. He taught her that power, when wielded with compassion and integrity, could be a force for profound good. Years later, on a warm summer afternoon, they sat together on the same stone bench in the garden where he had first seen her sketches. The scent of lavender and roses hung heavy in the air, and the sound of children's laughter, their children's laughter, drifted from the lawn. Alistair watched as Alara, now his Duchess but forever his Alara, added a few finishing touches to a drawing in her sketchbook. He leaned over to look. It was a sketch of them sitting on this very bench. But this time, the man in the drawing was not the solitary, weary Alec, nor the formidable Duke. He was smiling, his expression one of deep, abiding peace. She looked up and met his gaze, her gray eyes full of the same love and understanding that had bridged the chasm between them. He took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. His hands were no longer the smooth hands of an idle aristocrat, nor the falsely calloused hands of a footman in disguise. They were the hands of a man who worked, who loved, who lived. They were the hands of a husband, a father, a partner. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her earth-stained knuckles. In the quiet of their shared garden, surrounded by the life they had built together on a foundation of hard-won truth, the Duke who had once hidden his heart had finally, truly, come home.